Tom Martinez had lived on his family ranch for 37 years, watching the endless expanse of rolling hills and oak trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. The 200-acre property had been in his family for 4 generations, passed down from his great-grandfather who had settled the land in 1898. What Tom didn't know was that his quiet rural life was about to collide with the ambitions of developers and the iron fist of a homeowners association in the most unexpected way possible. The trouble began on a crisp October morning when Tom found an official-looking envelope tucked into his mailbox. The return address read Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and Tom frowned as he tore open the letter. He had never heard of any Meadowbrook Estates, and certainly hadn't joined any homeowners association. As he unfolded the crisp white paper, his confusion turned to disbelief and then to anger. The letter was a formal notice of violation, citing him for multiple infractions, including failure to maintain landscaping standards, having livestock on residential property, operating a commercial farming operation without proper permits, and failure to submit architectural plans for his barn and outbuildings. The letter demanded immediate compliance and threatened daily fines of $500 until all violations were corrected. At the bottom, in bold red letters, was a total fine amount of $12,750. Tom read the letter 3 times before the full absurdity of it sank in. Someone was trying to fine him for living on his own ranch, for having his own cattle, and for buildings that had stood on his property since before he was born. He walked to his kitchen window and looked out at his peaceful spread, where his 20 head of cattle grazed contentedly in the morning sun. His grandfather's old red barn stood solid and weathered against the backdrop of ancient oak trees, and his workshop where he repaired farm equipment sat exactly where his father had built it 40 years ago. Grabbing his truck keys, Tom drove the winding country road toward town to figure out what in the hell was going on. As he crested the hill about 2 miles from his property, he stopped the truck and stared in amazement. Where once there had been nothing but empty pasture land now stood dozens of identical beige houses arranged in perfect rows, with matching driveways and manicured lawns. A large stone sign at the entrance read, Meadowbrook Estates, a premier planned community. Tom parked at the entrance and walked through the development, trying to understand how this entire neighborhood had appeared seemingly overnight. The houses were clearly new with fresh paint and recently planted landscaping, but they looked lived in, with cars in driveways and children playing in backyards. At the center of the development stood an impressive community center with a large parking lot and professionally maintained grounds. A woman in her 50s, wearing a pink tracksuit and walking a small white dog, approached him with a suspicious expression. She had the look of someone who made it her business to know everything that happened in her neighborhood, and Tom could tell she had already pegged him as someone who didn't belong. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that suggested she wasn't really asking permission to speak. "Are you a resident of Meadowbrook Estates? I don't recognize you, and we have very strict rules about visitors parking in the community." Tom tipped his hat politely. "No, ma'am, I'm not a resident. I live on the ranch just up the road, and I received this letter from your homeowners association." He pulled the violation notice from his shirt pocket and showed it to her. The woman's eyes lit up with the excitement of someone who had stumbled upon the juiciest gossip of the week. "Oh my goodness, you must be the rancher the HOA board has been talking about, Betty Williams and on the Architectural Review Committee. We've been getting complaints about your property for months." "Now, complaints," Tom repeated, unable to keep the incredulity out of his voice. "What kind of complaints?" Betty lowered her voice as if sharing state secrets. "Well, the smell for one thing, and all that noise from your animals. Plus your property is such an eyesore with all those old buildings and farm equipment scattered around. It really brings down the property values for our entire community. The board has been very patient, but enough is enough." Tom stared at this woman who was telling him that his family ranch was somehow bringing down property values for a development that hadn't even existed 6 months ago. He bit back his first response, which would have involved some colorful language about what she could do with her property values, and instead asked as calmly as he could manage, "When exactly was this neighborhood built?" "We've been here for almost 2 years now, Betty said proudly. This is one of the finest planned communities in the county. We have a swimming pool, tennis courts, a fitness center, and the most beautiful community garden you've ever seen. The developer really spared no expense. 2 years, Tom thought to himself. He had been working his land every single day for the past 2 years, and he was certain there hadn't been any construction happening on the adjacent property. He would have noticed dozens of houses being built practically next door to his ranch. Something wasn't adding up, but he decided to play along and see what else he could learn. "Who is your HOA president?" Tom asked. "That would be Richard Stone," Betty replied with obvious admiration. "He's a retired real estate developer, and he really knows how to run things properly. He's the one who finally decided to take action about your property violations. You should probably go speak with him directly. If you want to resolve this matter," she pointed toward a large house at the end of the street that was significantly bigger than the others. "Richard lives in the estate home at the end of Maple Lane. He's usually home in the afternoons, working in his office. But I should warn you, he's not someone who tolerates nonsense. He expects people to follow the rules." Tom thanked Betty for the information and walked back to his truck, feeling more confused than ever. As he drove home, he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The development looked legitimate enough, and the residents clearly believed they lived there, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. The timing didn't match his memory, and the location seemed off somehow. Back at his ranch, Tom pulled out his property deed and surveyed maps to double-check his boundaries. According to his records, his property extended well beyond what he had been actively using for grazing and farming. The northern section had been left mostly wild over the years, with dense woods and steep terrain that made it unsuitable for cattle. He had rarely ventured into that area except for occasional hunting trips with his father when he was younger. Studying the survey map more carefully, Tom realized that the new development appeared to be built partially on what should be the northern edge of his property. If his deed was accurate, then at least some of those houses and possibly the community center itself might be sitting on his land. But that seemed impossible. Surely a developer wouldn't build an entire neighborhood without proper title research. In land surveys, Tom decided he needed professional help to sort this out. The next morning, he drove to the county courthouse to pull public records on both his property and the new development. The clerk in the records office was a friendly older gentleman named Frank, who had worked there for over 20 years and knew Tom from his occasional visits to update property tax information. "Well, hello there," Frank said as he approached the counter. "What brings you in today?" Tom explained his situation and asked to see all the recent filings related to the Meadowbrook Estates development. Frank disappeared into the back room for nearly an hour before returning with a thick stack of documents. In a puzzled expression, "This is mighty strange, Tom," Frank said, shaking his head. "According to these records, the Meadowbrook Estates development was approved and built starting 3 years ago, but I don't remember processing most of these documents. Some of these signatures and notarizations look questionable to me." Frank spread out several documents on the counter, including survey maps, building permits, and deed transfers. As they examined the papers together, Tom could see that someone had been very busy creating an elaborate paper trail for the development. But the more they looked, the more inconsistencies they found. "Look here," Frank said, pointing to a survey map dated 2 years earlier. "This shows your property ending at Miller Creek, which is at least half a mile east of where your actual boundary line runs. And this deed transfer supposedly selling 40 acres of your land to the development company is dated 6 months. Before the signature was notarized, Tom studied his own property deed, which clearly showed his land extending much further north than the development survey indicated. According to the original 1898 deed and all subsequent surveys, his property ran all the way to the base of Sunset Ridge, which was at least a quarter-mile past where the community center now stood. "Frank, this looks like someone has been falsifying documents," Tom said. "My land clearly extends under at least part of that development, and I never sold or transferred any of my property to anyone." Frank nodded grimly. "That's what it looks like to me too. But this is way beyond what I can handle. You need to get yourself a good lawyer and probably contact the district attorney's office. This looks like fraud on a pretty massive scale." Tom gathered copies of all the relevant documents and drove home with his head spinning. Someone had not only built a development on his land without his knowledge, but had also created an elaborate web of false documents to make it appear legal. And now they had the audacity to send him violation notices for living on his own property. That evening, Tom called his cousin Jake, who was a real estate attorney in the state capital. After explaining the situation and emailing copies of the documents, Jake agreed to drive down the next day to see the development firsthand and help Tom figure out his next steps. Jake arrived the following morning, and the two men spent several hours comparing the actual property boundaries with the survey maps and deeds. Using a GPS unit and the original survey markers, they were able to confirm that Tom's property did indeed extend well into the Meadowbrook Estates development. The community center and at least a dozen houses were clearly sitting on land that belonged to Tom. "This is unbelievable," Jake said as they stood in the community center parking lot looking at his GPS readings. "According to your deed, we are standing on your property right now. That means not only did someone steal your land, but they built an entire community on it and are now trying to fine you for living on the part they didn't steal." Jake took photos and measurements throughout the development documenting exactly which structures were built on Tom's property. They also interviewed several residents who confirmed that the development had been built much more recently than the official records indicated. Most residents had moved in within the past 8 months, despite documents claiming the neighborhood was 2 years old. As they were finishing their survey, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit approached them. He had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge, and Tom immediately suspected this was Richard Stone, the HOA president Betty had told him about. "Excuse me, gentlemen," the man said in a voice that carried clear authority. Richard Stone, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. "I understand you are the owner of the ranch property that has been violating our community standards. I'm here to discuss a resolution to this matter." Tom studied the man carefully, noting his polished appearance and practiced demeanor. This was clearly someone who was used to getting his way through a combination of intimidation and legal maneuvering. But Tom had dealt with his share of smooth-talking city folks over the years, and he wasn't easily impressed. "Mr. Stone," Tom replied evenly. "I'm Tom Martinez, and this is my cousin Jake, who's an attorney. We're here trying to figure out how your community center ended up being built on my family ranch." Richard smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Martinez, I think there may be some confusion about property boundaries. Our development was properly surveyed and all land acquisitions were handled through legitimate real estate transactions. If you have concerns about your property lines, I suggest you hire a surveyor to clarify the matter." Jake stepped forward, holding up his GPS unit and a copy of Tom's deed.
Ow.
"Mr. Stone, we're not confused about anything. This GPS reading shows we are currently standing on property that has belonged to the Martinez family since 1898. Your community center and several houses are built on stolen land." Richard's polished demeanor slipped slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. "That's a very serious accusation, young man. I hope you have solid evidence to back up such claims, because false accusations of theft can result in expensive lawsuits for defamation." Tom could see that Richard was trying to intimidate Jake, but his cousin had dealt with plenty of bullies in his legal career and wasn't backing down. Jake pulled out copies of the documents they had obtained from the courthouse and spread them on the hood of his truck. "Actually, Mr. Stone, we have extensive evidence of document fraud and land theft. Take a look at these survey maps and deed transfers. The dates don't match the notarizations, and several signatures appear to be forged. This is shaping up to be a major criminal case." Richard examined the documents with growing concern, and Tom could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. After several minutes of studying the papers, Richard looked up with a forced smile. "Gentlemen, I think there may have been some administrative errors in the filing process. These things happen sometimes with large developments involving multiple properties and agencies. I'm sure we can work something out that satisfies everyone involved." Jake gathered up the documents and shook his head. "Mr. Stone, this isn't about administrative errors. This is about stealing someone's land and then having the nerve to fine them for living on their own property. My cousin is going to be filing both criminal and civil charges, and I suspect the FBI will be very interested in this pattern of document fraud. Richard's facade finally cracked completely, and his voice took on a desperate edge. Look, you don't understand. The situation here are a lot of innocent people who bought houses in good faith. If this development gets shut down, it will destroy dozens of families who invested their life savings in these homes. Tom had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, but Richard's attempt to play the victim card was the last straw. Mr. Stone, those innocent people bought houses on stolen land. That's not my fault, and it's not my problem. You created this mess when you decided to build on property you didn't own. Richard tried. One more approach, switching to what Tom assumed was his best deal-making voice. Mr. Martinez, you're a reasonable man. What would it take to make this situation go away? Surely we can come to some sort of financial arrangement that compensates you fairly for any inconvenience. Tom looked at this man who had stolen his land, built houses on it, created fake documents to cover his tracks, and then tried to fine him for living on his own ranch. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. Now Richard wanted to buy his way out of the consequences with what was essentially a bribe. Mr. Stone, Tom said quietly, there is no amount of money that would make me forget that you stole my land. You built houses on property that belonged to my great-grandfather, and my grandfather, and my father. You forged documents and committed fraud, and then you tried to extort money from me with fake violation notices. The only thing I'm interested in now is seeing you in prison. Richard backed away from the truck, looking genuinely frightened for the first time. You don't know what you're getting into, Martinez. There are powerful people involved in this development, and they don't like to be crossed. You might want to think carefully before you make enemies you can't afford to have. Jake stepped between Richard and Tom with his phone already in his hand. Hey, did you just threaten my client, Mr. Stone, because I recorded that entire conversation? And threatening witnesses in a fraud investigation is a federal crime. Richard turned and walked quickly toward his house without another word. Tom and Jake watched him go, and then continued their documentation of the property boundaries. By the end of the day, they had conclusive evidence that approximately 30% of the Meadowbrook Estates development, including the community center, the main entrance, and 12 houses were built on Tom's property. That evening, Jake called his contacts at the district attorney's office and the State Bureau of Investigation to report the fraud. He also began preparing civil lawsuits against Richard Stone, the development company, and the construction contractors who had built on stolen land. Tom spent the evening going through his father's old papers, looking for any additional documentation that might be relevant to the case. 3 days later, Tom was awakened at dawn by the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into his driveway. Looking out his bedroom window, he saw several police cars and unmarked sedans parked near his house. For a moment, he wondered if Richard had somehow managed to have him arrested, but then he recognized Jake getting out of one of the cars along with several official-looking people in suits. Tom dressed quickly and met the group on his front porch. Jake introduced the others as investigators from the district attorney's office, the State Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI, white-collar crime unit. They had come to conduct a formal survey of the property and gather evidence for the criminal investigation. Over the next 6 hours, the investigators thoroughly documented the property boundaries and confirmed that a significant portion of the development was built on Tom's land. They also discovered that Richard Stone was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Robert Steinberg, and he had been involved in similar land fraud schemes in 3 other states. The investigation revealed that Robert had targeted Tom's property specifically because it was isolated and the northern boundary was heavily wooded, making it unlikely that encroachment would be noticed immediately. He had used a network of corrupt surveyors, notaries, and county officials to create the false documentation needed to make the land theft pure legitimate. The scheme had worked perfectly until Tom received the HOA violation notice. Robert had gotten greedy and decided to try to extract additional money from Tom by treating him like a resident of the development he had built on stolen land. It was a move that demonstrated breathtaking arrogance and ultimately led to his downfall. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that the Meadowbrook Estates fraud was just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Robert and his associates had been running similar schemes across multiple states, stealing rural land from unsuspecting property owners and selling it to developers or building on it themselves. The legitimate residents of Meadowbrook Estates found themselves in an impossible situation. They had purchased their homes in good faith, but those homes were now evidence in a criminal case and could potentially be demolished. Many families faced financial ruin as their mortgages exceeded the value of homes that might not legally exist. Tom felt genuinely sorry for the innocent homeowners, but he also knew that he couldn't be held responsible for Robert's crimes. His property had been stolen, and he had every right to reclaim it regardless of who might be harmed in the process. Jake advised him that while the legal process would be lengthy and complicated, his ownership rights were absolutely clear and would ultimately be upheld. The criminal investigation moved quickly once the FBI became involved. Within 2 weeks, Robert Steinberg and 6 associates were arrested on federal charges including wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. The charges carried potential prison sentences of up to 20 years and millions of dollars. In fines, Robert initially tried to fight the charges, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The FBI had recovered dozens of forged documents, computer records, showing the planning of the fraud scheme and financial records proving that millions of dollars in stolen property had been sold or developed. Facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Robert eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. During his debriefing, Robert revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Over the past 5 years, he and his network had stolen over 2,000 acres of rural land across 7 states and defrauded property owners and home buyers out of more than $50 million. Tom's case was actually one of the smaller operations, but it was also one that finally brought down the entire network. The civil litigation was more complex than the criminal case because it involved dozens of innocent homeowners who had purchased property in good faith. Jake filed lawsuits against Robert, the development company, the construction contractors, and the title insurance companies, seeking both the return of Tom's land and monetary damages for the years of unauthorized use. The homeowners hired their own attorney to try to protect their interests, but their legal position was extremely weak. Under property law principles that dated back centuries, they could not claim ownership of land that had been stolen from the true owner, regardless of their innocent intentions or financial investments. Jake negotiated with the homeowner's attorney to try to find a solution that would minimize the hardship for the families while still protecting Tom's rights. After months of discussions, they reached a complex settlement agreement that divided the financial responsibility among all the parties who had profited from the fraud. Under the settlement agreement, Tom would regain full ownership of his stolen land but would lease back the portion containing houses to the current residents for a period of up to 10 years at below market rates. This would give the homeowners time to either relocate or potentially purchase their lots at fair market value if they chose to stay. The community center and common areas built on Tom's land would be demolished and the land restored to its natural state. Tom would receive monetary damages from the construction companies and title insurance carriers to compensate him for the unauthorized use of his property, the costs of the legal battle. The settlement was not perfect from anyone's perspective, but it provided a workable solution to an impossible situation created by Robert's criminal actions. Tom would eventually recover his full property rights and receive financial compensation, while the homeowners would have time to adjust to their new circumstances without facing immediate eviction. As the legal proceedings played out, Tom found himself dealing with a wide range of reactions from the Meadowbrook Estates residents. Some were genuinely apologetic and understanding about the situation, recognizing that Tom was as much a victim of Robert's fraud as they were. Others were angry and resentful, blaming Tom for their financial losses even though he had done nothing wrong. Betty Williams, the woman Tom had first met during his initial visit to the development, was among those who remained hostile. She organized a group of residents to pressure Tom to simply give up his land claims and allow them to stay permanently without compensation. When Tom refused, she began spreading rumors that he was being greedy and vindictive toward innocent families. The rumors and hostility bothered Tom more than he cared to admit. He had lived his entire life in the area and had always prided himself on being a good neighbor and a fair man. Now he found himself portrayed as the villain in a situation where he was clearly the victim. It was a painful reminder that doing the right thing doesn't always make you popular. Jake helped. Tom put the situation in perspective by pointing out that Betty and her allies were simply looking for someone to blame for their misfortune. Robert was in prison and beyond their reach, so Tom became a convenient target for their anger and frustration. Their behavior said more about their character than his. The criminal trial of Robert Steinberg and his associates was a media sensation that drew attention from across the country. The scheme was so audacious and the scope so broad that it captured public imagination in a way that most white-collar crime cases do not. Tom found himself testifying before packed courtrooms and giving interviews to reporters from major newspapers and television networks. During his testimony, Tom described the surreal experience of receiving violation notices for living on his own ranch and discovering that strangers had built houses on his land. His calm, straightforward manner and obvious sincerity made him a sympathetic figure in media coverage and helped generate public support for his case. Robert received a sentence of 18 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution of over $30 million to his victims. His associates received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, depending on their level of involvement in the scheme. The judge called it one of the most brazen cases of land theft he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. With the criminal case concluded and the civil settlements finalized, Tom was finally able to begin the process of reclaiming his property. The community center was demolished first, followed by the entrance sign and landscaping. Watching the heavy equipment tear down the buildings that had been built on his stolen land, Tom felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He was glad to have his property back, but he also knew that dozens of families had been hurt by Robert's crimes. The financial settlement would help, but it couldn't fully compensate for the emotional trauma and disruption they had experienced. Tom found himself wishing there had been a way to punish Robert without harming the innocent homeowners, as promised in the settlement agreement. Tom allowed the residents whose houses were on his land to continue living there under lease arrangements. Most of the families eventually chose to relocate rather than deal with the ongoing uncertainty and stigma associated with the development. A few decided to stay and eventually purchased their lots from Tom at fair market prices. The restoration of the stolen portion of his property took several months and cost Tom a significant amount of money. Despite the settlement payments, the heavy construction equipment had compacted the soil and damaged the natural drainage patterns. Invasive plants introduced during the landscaping had spread throughout the area and required extensive removal efforts. Tom hired an environmental restoration company to help return the land to its original condition. They removed all traces of the community center and parking areas replanted native grasses and wildflowers and restored the natural creek beds that had been diverted during construction. It was expensive and time-consuming work, but Tom felt it was important to heal the damage that had been done to his family's land. The experience changed Tom in ways he hadn't expected. Before the fraud, he had been content to live quietly on his ranch without much interaction with the outside world. The legal battle had forced him to become more assertive and to deal with lawyers, porters, and government officials on a regular basis. Tom discovered that he had a talent for explaining complex, legal, and technical issues in simple terms that ordinary people could understand. His testimony during the criminal trial was praised by prosecutors for its clarity and effectiveness. Several reporters told him he had a gift for making complicated situations understandable. After the case was resolved, Tom was approached by advocacy groups representing rural property owners who asked him to speak at conferences and help with other land fraud cases. He found that he enjoyed the work and was good at helping other victims navigate the legal system and media attention. Tom began traveling around the country, speaking to farmers, ranchers, and other rural property owners about how to protect themselves from land fraud schemes. He worked with law enforcement agencies to help them understand the tactics used by criminals like Robert and testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger property protection laws. The work was rewarding, but it also kept Tom away from his ranch more than he liked. He hired a neighbor to help care for his cattle and maintain the property, but he missed the daily routine of ranch life. After 2 years of constant travel, Tom decided to scale back his advocacy work and focus more on rebuilding his life at home. Tom used part of the settlement money to make improvements too. His ranch that he had been putting off for years, he built a new barn to replace the one his grandfather had constructed and installed modern fencing and water systems throughout the property. He also bought additional cattle and expanded his operation to include some of the land that had been restored after the development was removed. The northern section of his property, where the community center had stood, became a beautiful meadow, filled with wildflowers and native grasses. Tom often rode his horse through the area in the evenings, reflecting on how different his life had become because of a simple violation notice in his mailbox. 5 years after the fraud was discovered, Tom received a letter from Robert Steinberg in federal prison. Robert wrote that he wanted to apologize for the harm he had caused and to explain his actions. The letter was filled with self-justification and excuses, but it did contain what seemed to be a genuine expression of remorse for the pain he had inflicted on innocent people. Tom read the letter several times but never responded to it. He had no interest in providing Robert with the absolution he seemed to be seeking. Some actions were simply unforgivable, and stealing someone's family land and then trying to extort money from them fell into that category. The Meadowbrook Estates development still existed, but it was much smaller than it had been originally. About half of the houses had been demolished when their owners were unable to obtain clear title or financing. The remaining homes were eventually sold at significantly reduced prices to buyers who were willing to accept the complicated legal history. Betty Williams was among those who chose to stay in the development despite the ongoing problems. She never apologized to Tom for her hostility during the legal proceedings, but she did stop spreading rumors about him. On the rare occasions when they crossed paths in town, she would nod politely, but they never spoke. Tom learned from Jake that several other victims of Robert's fraud network had successfully recovered their stolen property through criminal prosecution and civil litigation. The FBI estimated that over 80% of the stolen land had been returned to its rightful owners, and that most victims had received at least partial financial compensation. The case became a model for how law enforcement agencies could effectively investigate and prosecute complex land fraud schemes. The techniques developed during the investigation were incorporated into training programs for prosecutors and investigators across the country. Tom took some satisfaction in knowing that his ordeal had helped protect other property owners from similar crimes. As Tom entered his 70s, he began thinking about the future of his ranch and what would happen to the land after he was gone. He had no children of his own, but he had several nephews and nieces who had expressed interest in continuing the family tradition of ranching. He worked with Jake to create a trust that would ensure the property remained in the family and could never again be stolen or fraudulently transferred. Tom also established a scholarship fund to help young people from rural areas pursue careers in law enforcement and legal advocacy. He had learned during his ordeal how important it was to have dedicated professionals who understood rural issues and were willing to fight for property rights. The scholarship was his way of ensuring that future generations would have protectors. Looking back on the entire experience, Tom realized that receiving that HOA violation notice had been both the worst and best thing that had ever happened to him. It had caused tremendous stress and disruption to his peaceful life, but it had also led to the recovery of stolen land and the dismantling of a major criminal enterprise. More importantly, the experience had shown Tom that he was capable of much more than he had ever imagined. He had successfully taken on criminals with unlimited resources and government agencies with vast bureaucracies. He had testified before federal judges and spoken to audiences of thousands of people. He had become an advocate for rural property rights and had helped other victims recover their stolen land. The quiet rancher who had once been content to live in isolation had become a nationally recognized expert on land fraud and property rights. It was not a transformation he had sought or expected, but it was one that had given new meaning and purpose to his life. Tom still lived on the same ranch where he had grown up, and he still raised cattle on the same land as great-grandfather. had settled over a century ago. But he was no longer the same man who had opened that violation notice with confusion and anger. He had been tested in ways he never could have anticipated and had emerged stronger and more confident than ever before. The land that had been stolen from him was now more beautiful than it had been before the fraud. The restoration work had improved the natural habitat, and wildlife had returned to areas that had been disturbed by construction. Tom often saw deer and wild turkeys in the meadow where the community center had once stood, and he took that as a sign that the land was healing from the wounds inflicted by Robert's crimes. On quiet evenings, Tom would sit on his front porch and look out over his recovered property, feeling grateful for the chain of events that had led to justice being served. The HOA that had tried to fine him for living on his own land was gone. The community center built on stolen property had been demolished. The criminals responsible for the fraud were in prison. Most importantly, Tom had learned that sometimes the most outrageous injustices can lead to the most satisfying victories. The violation notice that had initially filled him with anger had ultimately become the key that unlocked a major criminal conspiracy and returned stolen land to its rightful owner. Tom Martinez had started as a simple rancher, minding his own business on his family land. He had become a symbol of the fight against rural land fraud and a protector of property rights for farmers and ranchers across the country. It was a legacy he never could have imagined, but one he was proud to leave for future generations. Land endured as it always had, through drought and flood, through theft and recovery, through injustice and redemption. And Tom endured with it, stronger and wiser for having fought the good fight and won against impossible odds. The ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations would remain in the family for many generations to come, protected by laws, strengthened through his struggle, and watched over by those he had inspired to defend the rights of property owners everywhere.